Stevens in the House had by his diplomacy ranged back of his policy the industrial leaders of the North, who feared that a return of the South would mean an attack upon the tariff, the national banks, the debt, and the whole new post-war economic structure. Sumner in the Senate, on the other hand, took little account of the political game. He set his strategy on the high ground of democracy, and democracy for all men. And it was his opposition that killed the first draft of the 14th Amendment, which permitted the disenfranchisement of Negroes on penalty of reduced representation. Stevens, with infinite pains, had gotten this much through the Committee of 15 and the House of Representatives. Sumner spoke his convictions, despite the desertion of friends and the party. Senator Wiliams of Oregon expressed admiration, but could not follow him. The echoes of his lofty and majestic periods would linger and repeat themselves among the corridors of history. There was a wide discussion throughout the country. Garrison was converted, and to him Sumner's speech would seem unanswerable. To Whittier, it was irresistible. Phillips' voice was filled with enthusiasm. While Henry Ward Beecher said that the speech rose far above the occasion, covering a ground which will abide after all contemporary questions of special legislation have passed away. The proposed amendment went down to defeat on March 9th, receiving only 25 votes against 22, instead of the necessary two-thirds majority. Sumner's wide influence, while it did not command the full sympathy of Republicans or Democrats, nevertheless was enough to block compromise between the Northern industry and the abolition of democracy. Facesson was bitter and Stevens furious. No man demanded more for Negroes than Stevens, or was more thoroughly an advocate of complete democracy. But as he said, the control of the republic depends on the number, not the quality of the voters. This is not a government of saints. It has a large sprinkling of sinners. As the head of the Committee of 15, he was trying to get a proposition for those two-thirds majority of Congress that would vote and start a country as far on the road toward democracy and abolition of the caste as was possible under the circumstances. He complained that his proposition had been slaughtered by a puerile and pedantic criticism. Andrew Johnson was deeply incensed by Sumner's speech and sneered at it the next day. I am free to say to you that I do not like to be arraigned by someone who can get up a handsomely rounded periods and deal in rhetoric and talk about abstract ideas of liberty, who never periled life, liberty, or property. This kind of theoretical, hollow, unpractical friendship amounts to but very little. He was receiving a group of Negroes who were trying by direct appeal either to get his sympathy or to probe his animus against the race. The Freedmen's Bureau bill had passed, but Johnson had not yet indicated what action he would take. The Civil Rights Bill and the first draft of the 14th Amendment were before the Senate. Perhaps the delegation hoped to influence him. Douglas had seen Johnson on Inauguration Day in 1865, when President Lincoln had pointed Douglas out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was a true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. Seeing that, I observed him, he tried to assume a more friendly appearance, but it was too late. In the interview with President Johnston, February 7, 1866, there were present George T. Downing of Rhode Island, William E. Matthews of New York, John Jones of Philadelphia, John F. Cook of Washington, Joseph E. Otis, A.W. Ross, Williams Whipper, John M. Brown, Alexander Dunlap, Frederick Douglass, and his son Lewis. What was said on the occasion brought the whole question virtually before the American people. Until that interview, the country was not fully aware of the intentions and policy of President Johnson on the subject of Reconstruction, especially in respect to the newly emancipated class of the South. After having heard the brief address made by him to Mr. Downing and myself, he occupied at least 3/4 of an hour in what seemed a set speech, and refused to listen to any reply on our part, although solicited to grant a few moments for that purpose. The president shook hands with the colored men, and then George T. Downing, a leading Negro from Newport, Rhode Island, opened the discussion. He said to the president, "We desire for you to know that we come feeling that we are friends, meeting a friend." He said that we are represented colored people from the state of Illinois, Wisconsin, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, and the New England states and the District of Columbia. They were not satisfied with the amendment prohibiting slavery, but wanted it enforced by the appropriate legislation. We are Americans, native-born Americans. We are citizens. We see no recognition of color or race in the organic law of the land. It has been shown in the present war that the government may justly reach its strong arm into the states and demand from those who owe it allegiance their assistance and support. May it not reach out like an arm to secure and protect its subjects upon whom it has claim? Then Frederick Douglass came forward and said, "Your noble and humane predecessor placed in our hands the sword to assist in saving the nation, and we do hope that you, his able successor, will favorably regard the placing it in our hands, the ballot with which to save ourselves." The president was evidently embarrassed and floundered. He was not going to make a speech. He had jeopardized life, liberty, and property, not for the people, the colored people, but for the great mass of people. He was a friend of the colored man, but I do not want to adopt a policy that I believe will end in the contest between the races, which, if persisted in, will result in the extermination of one or the other. He remembered his speech to Nashville Negroes before the election and repeated his willingness to be a Moses to lead them from bondage to freedom, but not into a war of races. He said that one can talk about a ballot box and justice and the Declaration of Independence, but suppose by some magic touch you can say to everyone, "You shall vote tomorrow." How much would that ameliorate their condition at this time? Then the president approached Douglass and said, "Now, let us get closer to the subject." He said he opposed slavery because it was a monopoly and gave profit and power to the aristocracy. But getting clear of the monopoly, they had abolished slavery. Douglass started to interrupt, but the president was not through. He went on to show the position of the poor white in relationship to slave owners and how slaves despised the poor whites. Douglass denied this personally, but the president insisted that anyway, most colored people did. During the war, and if he had a poor white come into competition at the ballot box, the war of races would result. Moreover, it was proper to put on a people without their consent, Negro suffrage. Do you deny that first great principle of the right of the people is to govern themselves? Here, Downing interrupted. Apply what you said, Mr. President, to South Carolina. For instance, where a majority of the inhabitants are colored. The president twisted uncomfortably and said that the matter to which he referred comes up when a government is undergoing a fundamental change. And he preferred to stay to instance Ohio rather than South Carolina. Was it right to force Ohio to make a change in the elective franchise against its will? He could not touch the question as to whether it was right to prevent a majority in South Carolina from ruling because, to his mind, no number of Negroes could outweigh the will of whites. He stumbled on without mentioning this suppressed minor premise and said, "It is a fundamental tenet of my creed that the will of the people must be obeyed." Is there anything wrong and unfair in that? Douglass smiled, still thinking of South Carolina. "A great deal is wrong, Mr. President, with all respect." But the president insisted, "It is the people of the states that must for themselves determine this thing. I do not want to be engaged in a work that will commence a war of the races." Then he indicated that the interview was at its end. He was glad to have met them, and he thanked them for the compliment paid to him. Douglas returned the thanks and said that they had not come to argue, but if the president would grant permission, we would like to endeavor to controvert some of the positions you have assumed. Mr. Downing, too, suggested persuasively that the president, by his kind explanation, must have contemplated some reply to the views he had advanced. Douglas continued, I would like to say one or two words in reply. You enfranchised your enemies and disenfranchised your friends. My own impression is that the very thing that your excellency would avoid in the states can only be avoided by the very measure that we proposed. I would like to say a word or so in regard to the matter of the enfranchisement of blacks as it means to preventing the very thing which your excellency seems to apprehend, that it is a conflict of the races. The president naturally did not want to give publicity to views of the Negro antagonistic to his own, and he said shortly that there were other places beside the South for the Negro to live. But Douglas, the masters, said that the masters have been making laws, and we cannot get away from the plantation. What prevents you? Asked Johnson. Douglas replied that his master then decides for him where he shall go, where he shall work, how much he shall work. He is absolutely in the hands of those men. The president replied, if the master now controls him or his actions, would he not control him in his vote? Douglas answered, let the Negro once understand that he has the organic right to vote, and he will raise up a party in the southern states among the poor who will rally him. There is this conflict that you speak of between the wealthy slave owner and the poor man. The president replied eagerly, you touched right upon the point there. There is this conflict, and hence I suggest immigration. The president then bowed his dark visitors out. He said they were all delirious of accomplishing the same ends, but proposed to do it so by following different roads. Douglas, turning to leave, said, the president sends us to the people, and we go to the people. Yes, yes, sir, answered the president. I have great faith in the people. I believe they will do what is right. After the colored delegation published a reply to various points brought up by the president, and especially stressed the matter of enmity between the Negroes and poor whites, the first point to which we feel especially bound to take exception is your attempt to found a policy opposed to our enfranchisement upon the alleged ground of an existing hostility on the part of former slaves toward white people in the South. We admit the existence of this hostility and hold that it is entirely reciprocal. But you obviously commit an error by drawing an argument from an incident of slavery and making it a basis for policy adapted to a state of freedom. The hostility between the whites and the blacks of the South is easily explained. It has its roots and sap in the relation of slavery and was incited on both sides by the cunning of the slave masters. Those masters secured their ascendancy over both the poor whites and blacks by putting enmity between them. They divided both to conquer each. There was no earthly reason why the blacks should not hate and dread the poor whites, when in the state of slavery, for it was from this class that their masters received their slave catchers, slave drivers, and overseers. They were the men called in upon occasions by the slave masters when any fiendish outrage was to be committed upon the slave. Now, sir, you cannot but perceive that this cause is the hatred removed. The effect must be removed also. Slavery is abolished. The cause of this antagonism is removed, and you must see that it is altogether illogical and putting new wine into old bottles to legislate from slave-holding premises for a people whom you have repeatedly declared it is your purpose to maintain their freedom. Besides, even if it were true, as you allege, that the hostility of the blacks toward the poor whites must necessarily project itself into the state of freedom, and that this enmity between the two races is even more intense in a state of freedom than in the state of slavery, In the name of heaven, we reverently ask, how can you, in view of your professed desire to promote the welfare of the black man, deprive him of all means and defense and clothe him, whom you regard his enemy, in the panoply of political power? Can it be that you recommend a policy which would arm the strong and cast down the defenseless? Can you, by any possibility of reasoning, regard this as just, fair, or wise? Experience proves that those most abuse who can abuse with the greatest impunity. On this colonization theory, you were pleased to broach, very much could be said. It is impossible to suppose, in view of the usefulness of the black man in times of peace as a laborer in the South, in this time of war, a soldier in the North, and the growing respect of his rights among the people, and his increasing adaptation to high state of civilization in the native land, that there can ever come a time when he can be removed from this country without a terrible shock to his prosperity and peace. The Committee of 15 began its work again. The indomitable Stevens never gave up, never despaired. If he could not get all he wanted, he stood fast and took what he could. He said sadly, June 13, 1866, in the House of Representatives, referring to the proposed 14th Amendment, with its permission to disenfranchise the Negro. In my youth, in my manhood, in my old age, I have fondly dreamed that when any fortunate chance should have broken up for a while the foundations of our institution and released us from obligations the most tyrannical that ever man imposed in the name of freedom, that one intelligent, pure, and just men of this republic, true to their professions and their consciences, would have so remodeled all their institutions as to have freedom for them, the vestige of human oppression, of equality of rights, and of recognized degradation of the poor, and the superior caste of the rich. In short, that no distinction would be tolerated in this purified republic but what arose from the merit and conduct. This bright dream has vanished, like the baseless fabrics of vision. I find that we shall be obliged to be content with the patching up the worst portions of this ancient edifice, and leaving it, in many of its parts, to be swept through by the tempest, frost, and the storms of despotism. Do you inquire why, holding these views and possessing some will of my own, I accept so imperfect a proposition? I answer, because I live among men and not among angels, among men as intelligent, as determined, and as independent as myself, who, not agreeing with me, do not choose to yield up their opinions to mine. Mutual concessions is our only resort, or mutual hostilities. The Committee of 15 now tried to find out by actual inquiry just what the situation in the South was with regard to the Negro. It did this not so much because anyone was in doubt, as because the situation of the Negro was the most appealing thing that could be used to bring the majority to vote for the industrial North. It would increase the tremendous moral afflatus which made the war more and more symbolic in the minds of the people of the United States of a great triumph of human freedom. Subcommittees of the main committee took testimony for months all over the South and eventually issued an unanswerable array of evidence. April 20th, Robert Dale Owen brought a proposal for the 14th Amendment to Stevens in the Committee of 15. Stevens picked up my manuscript, looked it over carefully, and then, in his impulsive way, said, "I'll be plain with you, Owen. We've had nothing before us that comes anywhere near being as good as this, or as complete. It would be likely to pass, too, if this was the best of it. We haven't had a majority, either in our committee or in Congress, for immediate suffrage, and I don't believe that the states have yet advanced so far that they would be willing to ratify it. I'll lay that amendment of yours before our committee tomorrow, if you say so, and I'll do my best to put it through." Previous to this time, the thought was to bring in several separate amendments. But now the attitude was to unite the whole matter in one comprehensive amendment, so that the proposition of April 21 was presented as follows. Section 1. No discrimination shall be made by any state, nor by the United States, as to the civil rights of persons because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2. From and after the 4th day of July, in the year 1876, no discrimination shall be made by any state, nor by the United States, as to the enjoyment of the classes of persons of the right of suffrage because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 3. Until the 4th day of July, 1876, no class of persons, as to the right of any of whom to suffrage discrimination shall be made by any state because of the race or color or previous condition of servitude shall be included in the basis of representation. Section 4. Debts incurred in aid of insurrection or the war against the Union and claims of compensation for loss of involuntary service or labor shall not be paid by any state nor by the United States. Bingham moved a 5th section into the amendment along the lines of his previous efforts. Section 5. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunity of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The Bingham proposal was first adopted and then struck out by the committee. It was voted 7-6, report, the first 3 sections to Congress. Bingham tried in vain to bring his proposal as a separate amendment. Thus, Owen's proposition was ordered and sent to Congress and had a good chance of being adopted. But Frederick, the chairman, was sick. And Verilord, he was decided to delay the final report until it was better. Stevens told Owens the sequel. Our action on your amendment, said Stevens, had it seemed gotten noise abroad. In the course of last week, the members from New York, from Illinois, and from your state too, Owen, from Indiana, held each separately a caucus to consider whether to equality of suffrage or to present or perspective ought to form the Republican program for the coming canvass. They were afraid, so some of them told us that if there was a nigger in the woodpile at all, that was the phrase, it would be used against them as an electioneering handle. And some of them hang their cowardice, that they might lose their elections. By inconsiderable majorities, each of these caucuses decided that Negro suffrage in any shape ought to be excluded from the platform, and they communicated these decisions to us. Our committee hadn't backbone enough to maintain its ground. Yesterday, the vote on your plan was reconsidered. Your amendment was laid on the table, and in the course of the next 3 hours, we contrived to patch together, what you've read this morning. The sections were changed so as simply to exclude disenfranchisement Negroes from being made the basis of the appointment. Wiliams then presented a new section which allowed the Negroes gradually to be enfranchised and thus gradually to become the basis of representation. Representatives shall be apportioned among several states, which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. But whenever any state the elective franchise shall be denied to any person of its male citizens not less than 21 years of age, or any way abridged, except for participation in the rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation in such state shall be reduced in proportion, which number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens, not less than 21 years of age. This was adopted as Section 2 of the final amendment. Finally, on this same date, the committee reinserted by a vote of 10-3 Bingham's proposition on civil rights as Section 1. Afterwards, Conklin, before the Supreme Court, explained this action. At the time the 14th Amendment was ratified, individuals and joint stock companies were appealing for congressional and administrative protection against the invidious and discriminating state and local taxes. One instance was that of an express company whose stock was owned largely by its citizens of the state of New York, who came with petitions and bills seeking acts of Congress to aid them in resisting what they deemed oppressive taxation in 2 states, and oppressive and ruinous rules of damage applied under the state laws. That complaints of oppression in respect of property and other rights made by citizens of northern states who took up residence in the South were rife in and out of Congress. The committee then considered Section 3. Mr. Harris moved to insert the following. Until the 4th day of July in the year 1870, all persons who voluntarily adhered to the late insurrection, giving it aid and comfort, shall be excluded from the right to vote for representatives in Congress and for electors for President and Vice President of the United States. This was finally adopted by a vote of 8-7. The committee then discussed the readmission of the Southern states with the 14th Amendment as a condition. Finally, the joint resolution and the bill concerning the readmission of Southern states were adopted by a vote of 12-3. This proposed amendment and bill were reported to the House April 30th, debated on May 8th, 9th, and 10th, and passed May 10th. Stevens defended it May 8th and May 10th. Our fathers had been compelled to postpone the principles of their great declaration and wait for their full establishment until a more propitious time. That time ought to be present now. But the public mind has been educated in error for a century. How difficult in a day to unlearn it. In rebuilding, it is necessary to clear away the rotten and defective portions of the old foundation, and to sink deep and find and repair the edifice upon the firm foundation of eternal justice. If perchance the accumulated quicksands render it impossible to reach in every part of a firm basis, then it becomes our duty to drive deep and solid the substituted piles on which to build. It would not be wise to prevent the raising of the structure because some corner of it might be founded upon materials subject to the inevitable laws of mortal decay. It were better to shelter the household and trust to the advancing progress of a higher morality and pure and more intelligent principle to underpin the defective corner. This proposition is not all that the committee desired. It falls far short of my wishes, but it fulfills my hopes. I believe it is all that can be obtained in this present state of the public opinion. Not only Congress, but several states are to be consulted. Upon a careful survey of the whole ground, we did not believe that the 19th of the loyal states could be induced to ratify any proposition more stringent than this. I say 19, for I utterly repudiate and scorn the idea that any state not acting in the Union is to be counted on the question of ratification. It is absurd to suppose that any more than 3/4 of the states that propose the amendment are required to make it valid, that states not here are to be counted as present. Believing that this is the best proposition that can be made effectual, I accept it. I shall not be driven by clamor or denunciation to throw away a great cause because it is not perfect. I will take all that I can get in the cause of humanity and leave it to be perfected by better men in better times. It may be that that time will not come while I am here to enjoy the glorious triumph, but that it will come is as certain as that there is a just God. Stevens then referred to the previous draft of the amendment. After having received the careful examination and appropriation of the committee, and having received the united Republican vote of 120 representatives of the people, it was denounced as utterly reprehensible and unpardonable, to be encountered as a public enemy, positively endangering the peace of the country and covering its name with dishonor. A wickedness on a larger scale than the crime against Kansas or the fugitive slave law, gross, foul, outrageous, and incredible injustice against the whole African race, with every other vulgar epithet which polished cultivation could command. I confess my mortification at its defeat. I grieved, especially because it almost closed the door of hope for the amelioration of the condition of the freedmen. But men in pursuit of justice must never despair. Let us again try to see whether we cannot devise some way to overcome the united forces of self-righteous Republicans and unrighteous Copperheads. It will not do for those who for 30 years have fought the beast of Ephesus to be frightened by the fangs of the modern catamounts. Thaddeus Stevens continued his speech, May 10th. Let not these friends of secession sing to me their siren song of peace and goodwill until they can stop my ears to the screams and groans of the dying victims at Memphis. I hold in my hand an elaborate account from a man whom I know to be of the highest respectability in the country, every word of which I believe. This account of that foul transaction only reached me last night. It is more horrible in its atrocity, although not to the same extent than the massacre at Jamaica. Tell me, Tennessee, or any other state that is loyal of whom such things are proved. Ah, sir, it was but 6 years ago when they were here, just before they went out to join the armies of Candeline, just before they left this hall. Those of you who were here will remember the scene in which every Southern member, encouraged by their allies, came forth in one yelling body because speech for freedom was being made here, when weapons were drawn and Barksdale Bowie knife gleamed before our eyes. Would you have these men back again so soon to reenact those scenes? Wait until I am gone, I pray you. I want not to go through it again. It will be but a short time for my colleagues to wait. Now, sir, if the gentleman had remembered the scene 20 years ago, when no man dared to speak without risking his life, when but a few men did do it, for there were cowards in those days, as there are in these, you would not have found them asking to bring these men in. And I only wonder that my friend from Ohio, Mr. Bingham, should intimate a desire to bring him here. The announcement of the vote May 10th was 128 to 37, 19 not voting. It was received with applause on the floor and in the galleries. Mr. Eldridge of Wisconsin rose angrily to question of order. I want to know if it is understood that the proceedings of this House are to be interrupted by those who come here to occupy the galleries. The gentleman from Wisconsin replied, the Speaker makes the point of order that expressions of approbation and disapprobation from persons occupying the gallery are not in order. The chair sustains the point of order, but Eldridge was still angry. I do not want our proceedings to be interrupted by the niggerheads in the gallery. The gallery hissed, and Stevens asked, is it in order for members of the floor to disturb those in the galleries? Members upon the floor should not insult the spectators in the gallery, said the Speaker. The 14th Amendment came up in the Senate April 30th, but Fessenden was still ill, and no action was taken for 2 weeks. Finally, May 23rd, Howard of Michigan began to debate. He declared that the object of the 14th Amendment was primarily to give Congress the power to enforce the guarantees of freedom in the first 8 amendments to the Constitution. The West, led by Sherman Doolittle and the others, tried to reintroduce voters as the basis of representation. New England, through Senator Wilson of Massachusetts, was opposed to striking from the basis of representation. 2,100,000 unnaturalized foreigners who gave the North 17 representatives. Sherman did not agree. If it is right to exclude 4 million of blacks in the southern states who are denied representation, is it not also right to exclude all other classes in every other state who are denied political power? The question of the Negro citizenship was discussed, and Julian of Indiana supposed the conservative stand to follow conservatism. We would recognize the revolting states as is in the Union. It opposes to the protection of the millions of loyal colored people in the South through the agency of the Freedmen's Bureau. It opposes the Civil Rights Bill. It opposes, with all bitterness, the policy of giving the freedmen the ballot. On the other hand, radicalism would hold treason a crime. It would base representation on actual voters. It favors the protection of the colored people of the South through the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill. It demands the ballot as the right of every colored citizen. Evidently, the breach between the East and the West was growing, and coupled with Sumner's attitude, it looked as though the 14th Amendment was again doomed. The Republican Party fell back upon the caucus. From May 24th to May 28th, the Senate was in session, but a few hours which gave the Republicans time to discuss the whole matter in the party caucus. The party at that time showed clear division into the conservative and industrial elements like Fessenden, Trumbull, and Morgan, and the abolition democracy led by Sumner, Wade, and Yates. The opposition of Sumner and the abolition democracy was finally overcome by the plain facts of the case. This was the utmost that could be gotten from Congress in defense of democracy. Was it not worth taking? What could be hoped for in the further delay? As a result of the caucuses, certain amendments were made. The second section was amended to strike out the word citizen and insert inhabitants, being citizens of the United States. A new first section was also inserted, that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they reside. The Senate's changes thus consisted in defining who were citizens and in substituting for disenfranchisement for all participants in succession until 1870. The ineligibility of certain high officials. It opened the elective franchise to such persons as the states may choose to admit. We have thus followed, as well as records led us, the inner history of the Reconstruction measures of Congress and the Committee of 15 and other sources. Now let us look at the proceedings of Congress, as negotiations on this matter rose among the leaders, here and there, now and then, in a sea of struggling, unorganized action. In the matter of civil rights, the final draft of the 14th Amendment said, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. My first proposition on civil rights was introduced into the House by Mr. Stevens, December 5th, 1865. On December 6th, Bingham of Ohio offered an amendment. Both these resolutions went to the Committee on the Judiciary. Two other propositions were introduced December 11th. February 1, 1866, a motion was passed directing the Committee of 15 to inquire into this matter. Wiliams suggested an amendment, February 5th, empowering Congress to enforce all obligations prohibitions, and disabilities imposed by the Constitution on several states. February 13, 1866, the Committee of 15, as we have noted in the House and by Mr. Fessenden in the Senate, both motions were indefinitely postponed, and there was a strong desire to get the whole final report of the Committee of 15. On March 9, 1866, while the Senate was discussing the apportionment of representatives, Senator Yates of Illinois moved an amendment for civil rights and political rights, but it secured only 7 votes. 2 other and similar propositions were made in the Senate, but received small support. The first section of the resolution, reported to the House April 30th, 1866, became eventually the civil rights section of the 14th Amendment passed by the House, but the Senate, as we have seen, did not adopt it. Several attempts were made to amend it in the Senate. Mr. Wade offered a substitute for the entire resolution, but the whole proposition failed. When the second proposition came before the Senate May 30th, Howard of Michigan, in behalf of the Senate members of the Joint Committee, presented a series of resolutions which had been adopted by the Republican caucus as a substitute for the House amendment. The substitute was accepted. The first change was to prefix the words to the first clause of the amendment. All persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Later, Fessenden of Maine secured the inclusion of naturalized persons. Senator Johnson of Maryland tried unsuccessfully to strike out the guarantee that states should not make or enforce any law to abridge the privileges of immunity of citizens. Disability for participation in succession was covered by Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress, or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in the insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such a disability. Fourth Amendments on disability for participation in the rebellion were introduced in 1866. In the report of the Committee of 15, April 30th, 1866, there was included a 3rd section by which all persons who voluntarily adhered to the late insurrection were excluded from the right to vote until July 4th, 1870. Attempts were made to amend this in the House. When the resolution reached the Senate, there were 15 attempts to alter this section. On May 30th, Senator Howard of Michigan, in behalf of the Senate members of the Joint Committee of the Reconstruction, presented a new draft in which he proposed, in place of the 3rd section, the provision which now appears in the 14th Amendment. Many efforts were made to amend it. The Democratic senators seemed to prefer the Howard substitute to the Howard Amendment. This section passed. The question of suffrage for Negroes was covered by Section 2. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for President and Vice President of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive or judicial officers of state, or the members of legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such a state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear the whole number of the male citizens 21 years of age in such state. This question of Negro suffrage gave rise to 5 proposed amendments just before the Civil War. All these excluded persons of Negro descent from the right to vote, and most of them excluded them from their right to hold office. In the opening days of the 39th Congress, there were 6 propositions to guarantee the right to vote to Negroes. 2 proposed an educational standard in voting for the federal officials. Boutwell proposed an amendment making unlawful any distinction in the elective franchise on account of race or color. Another amendment proposed to give Congress power to define the qualifications of voters and members of Congress and its presidential electors. Henderson, January 23, 1866, proposed an amendment denying the state the right to discriminate against voters on the count of race or color. January 22, 1866, the proposal on the apportionment of representatives and abridgment of representatives was represented by the Committee of 15 to the House. It was recommitted January 29th and reported again January 31, and it passed on January 31st. In the Senate, there were 5 attempts to amend this resolution. Sumner presented a resolution making color discrimination impossible in the courtroom or ballot box. This was rejected, 39-8. Howard proposed to admit to the franchised Negro in the Army and Navy, or those able to read and write, or those who had property to value of over $250. This was not acted on. Sumner again attempted to amend the resolution by making illegal discrimination on the account of race and color. It was lost, 39-8. A similar proposal by Yates of Illinois was rejected. 3 other propositions to amend the Constitution relative to the suffrage were introduced before the close of this Congress. One was a proposition by Stewart of Nevada on March 16th. This foreshadowed the subsequent Grandfather Clause. It admitted that Southern states, on several conditions, one was which the extension of the elective franchise to all persons upon the same terms and conditions, making no discrimination on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, provided that those who were qualified to vote in the year of 1860 by the laws of their respective states shall not be disenfranchised by any reason of new tests or conditions which have been or may be prescribed since that year. That's when the aforementioned condition shall have been complied with the ratified by the majority of the present voting population. A general amnesty shall be proclaimed. That all the loyal states be respectfully requested to incorporate in their constitutions an amendment corresponding to the one above described. That is not intended to assert a coercive power on the part of Congress in regard to the regulation of suffrage in the indifferent states, but only to make an appeal to their own good, sense of love and of country, with a view to the prevention of serious evils now threatened. Seward said in 1870, when the Reconstruction question arose about the 14th Amendment, I propose that all persons born in the United States after the date of Mr. Lincoln's proclamation abolishing slavery should be entitled to vote on arriving at the age of 21 years, and this should be entered into Reconstruction. The resolution for the new 14th Amendment passed the Senate June 8, 1866, by a vote of 33-11, 5 members not voting. The amendment resolution was brought before the House and was called up June 13th. After a limited debate, the amendments made by the Senate were concurred in a vote of 120-32, 32 not voting. Thus, the 14th Amendment was sent to the states for approval. After the President's veto of the Freedoms Bureau bill, many members wanted the question immediately reconsidered. And the day after the President's speech of February 22, Senator Wilson introduced a bill which was not reported. The legislatures of several states approved of a bill by petitions which urged maintaining the Bureau. The President tried to counteract this by sending 2 agents, General Steedman and Fullerton, to investigate the Bureau. They were both in sympathy with his policy and made a tour in 4 months. They commended Howard and believed that the Bureau had done much to preserve order and organize free labor, but that it had sometimes been dishonestly and injudiciously administered, and that it was time for this to come to an end. This report was widely circulated and discussed. The charges were investigated, and public confidence in the Bureau was shaken. Nevertheless, May 22nd, a bill to continue the Bureau was introduced. It differed from the bill of February 9th in limiting the Bureau to 2 years. Land held under Sherman's orders was to be restored to former owners, and other land furnished and dispossessed freedmen, Army officers were retained in the service of the Bureau, and commissioners were authorized to cooperate with agents of the benevolent associations. Property was to be appropriated for the education of the freedmen, and military protection of the civil rights guaranteed. After discussion, the bill passed the House May 29th by a vote of 96 to 32. In the Senate, the bill was amended and the conference was held. The conference agreed that the question arising out of Sherman's orders should be left entirely with the president for settlement on June 16th. The president vetoed the bill and called the Freedmen's Bureau a proposition to transfer 4 million slaves from their original owners to a new set of taskmasters. By a severe exercise of party discipline, according to Blaine, the necessary 2/3 vote was procured in each the House, and the bill passed over the president's veto on the same day that it was received. Thus, government guardianship of freedmen was given a temporary extension under the grudging and partial equitable administration. The disposition of Congress to yield in part to the president was manifest. On June 6th, the Committee of 15 was reappointed. Subcommittees had been taking testimony all over the South. The final report of the Committee of 15 was made June 18th. It made an 800-page book and 100,000 copies were distributed. Its majority and minority sections summed up the strongest arguments available for and against the proposed methods of Reconstruction. The party of the majority reported that Touch the Negro said, slavery had been abolished by the constitutional amendment. A large proportion of the population had become, instead of mere chattels, free men and citizens. Through all the past struggle, these had remained true and loyal, and had in large numbers fought on the side of the Union. It was impossible to abandon them without securing them their rights as free men and citizens. The whole civilized world would have cried out against such a base ingratitude. And the bare idea is offensive to all right-thinking men. Hence, it became important to inquire what could be done to secure their rights, civil and political. It was evident to your committee that the adequate security could only be found in appropriate constitutional provisions. The increase of representation necessarily resulting from the abolition of slavery was considered the most important element in the questions arising out of the changed condition of affairs, and the necessity for some fundamental actions in this regard seemed imperative. It appeared to your committee that the rights of these persons, by whom the basis of representation had been thus increased, should be recognized by the general government. While slaves, they were not considered as having any rights, civil or political. It did not seem just or proper that all the political advantages derived from their becoming free should be confined to their former masters, who had fought against the Union and withheld them from themselves, who had always been loyal. Doubts were entertained whether Congress had power, even under the amended Constitution, to prescribe the qualifications of voters in a state, or could act directly on the subject. It was doubtful in the opinion of your committee whether the states would consent to surrender a power that they had always exercised and to which they were attached, as the best, if not the only method of surmounting the difficulty, and the eminently just and proper in itself, your committee came to the conclusion that political power should be possessed in all the states exactly in the proportion as rights of suffrage should be granted, without distinction of color or race. It appears quite clear that the anti-slavery amendments, both to the state and federal constitutions, were adopted in the South with reluctancy by the bodies which did not adopt them, while in some states they had been either passed in silence or rejected. The language of all provisions and ordinances of these states on the subjects amounts to nothing more than an unwilling admission of the unwelcome truth. Looking still further at the evidence taken by your committee, it is found to be clearly shown by witnesses of the highest character and having the best means of observation that the Freedmen's Bureau, instituted for the relief and protection of freedmen and refugees, is almost universally opposed by the mass of the population and exists in the efficient condition only under military protection, while the Union of Men of the South are earnest in its defense, declaring with one voice that without its protection the colored people would not be permitted to labor at fair prices and could hardly live in safety. They also testify that without the protection of the United States troops, Union men, whether of northern or southern origin, would be obliged to abandon their homes. The feeling in many portions of the country toward emancipated slaves, especially among the uneducated and ignorant, is one of vindictive and malicious hatred. This deep-seated prejudice against the colored is assiduously cultivated by the public journals and leads to acts of cruelty, oppression, and murder, which the local authorities are at no pains to prevent or punish. There is no general disposition to place the colored race, constituting at least 2/5 of the population, upon terms even of civil equality, while many instances may be found where large planters and men of the better class accept the situation and honestly strive to bring about a better order of things by employing the freedmen at fair wages and treating them kindly. The general feeling and disposition among all classes are yet totally averse to the toleration of any class of people friendly to the Union, be they white or black, and this aversion is not infrequently manifested in insulting and offensive matter. This part of the report was signed by 12 members of the committee. The other 3 members submitted a minority report. It was in the main of the old metaphysical argument, signed by Johnson, the constitutional lawyer from Maryland, Rogers, the extreme advocate of Southern rights from New Jersey, and Gritter. They are asked to disenfranchise a numerous class of their citizens, and also to agree to diminish their representation in Congress, and of course in the Electoral College, or to admit the right of suffrage of their colored males of 21 years of age and upwards, a class now in a condition of almost utter ignorance, thus placing them on the same political footing with white citizens of that age, for reasons so obvious that the dullest may discover them. The right is not directly asserted of granting suffrage to the Negro. That would be obnoxious to most of the northern and western states, so much so that their consent was not to be anticipated. But as the plan adopted because of the limited number of Negroes in such states will have no effect on their representation, it is thought it may be adopted, while in southern states it will materially lessen their number. That these latter states will assent to the measure can hardly be expected. The effect, then, if not the purpose of this measure, is to forever deny the representative to such states, or, if they consent to the condition, to weaken their representative power, and thus probably secure a continuance of such a party in power as now controls the legislation of the government. The measure, in its terms and its effect, whether designed or not, is to degrade the southern states. To consent to it will be to consent to their own dishonor. Neither Sumner nor Stevens was satisfied with the 14th Amendment. On the last day of the session, July 28, 1866, Thaddeus Stevens made his last defense of Negro suffrage. He was, at the time, worn out. His health was precarious. He was 73 years of age, and he hardly expected to return to his seat in the House. With deep solemnity, he sought to make one more, perhaps an expiring effort to do something which shall be useful in my fellow men, something to elevate and enlighten the poor, the oppressed, and the ignorant in this great crisis of human affairs. A black man, he declared, must have the ballot, or he would continue to be a slave. There was some alleviation to a lot of the bondmen, but a freedman deprived of every human right is the most degraded of human beings. Without the protection of the ballot box, the freed men were the mere serfs and would become the victims of their former masters. He declared that what he had done for humanity. I know it is easy, he said, to protect the interests of the rich and the powerful, but it is a great labor to guard the rights of the poor and the downtrodden. It is the eternal labor of Sisyphus, forever to be renewed. In this, perhaps my final action on this great question, I can see nothing in my political course, especially in regard to human freedom, which I could wish to have expunged or changed. I believe that we must all account here for deeds done in the body, and that political deeds will be among those accounts. I desire to take to the bar of that final settlement the record which I shall this day make on the great question of human rights. While I am sure it will not make atonement for half of my errors, I hope it will be some palliation. Are there any who will venture to take this list with their negative seal upon it, and who will dare to unroll it before that stern judge who is the Father of all immortal beings, whom they have been trampled underfoot, and whose souls they have been crushing out? This was not, in fact, his last speech, but it had the tone of a final message. Congress adjourned before a congressional plan of Reconstruction reached its final form. But its general outline was clear, and no further compromise between the congressional majority and Johnson was possible. Already the president's attitude on the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction had led to 2 suicides, the resignation of 3 members of the cabinet, and although Stanton remained, his retention caused the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Sumner, much against his will, had remained silent when the Senate, by party caucus, had decided upon the 14th Amendment. On the last day of Congress, he wrote the Duchess of Argyll. The suffering of the South is great through the misconduct of the president. His course has kept the rebel spirit alive and depressed the loyal white and black. It makes me very sad to see this. Considering the difficulties of their position, the blacks have done wonderfully well. They should have had a Moses as a president, but they had found a Pharaoh. Particularly had the situation in Louisiana become tense. The New Orleans riot of July 30th, 1866 confirmed the abolitionists in their own opinion that the reconstructed states were in the power of the rebels, and that they were using their power to put the Negro back into slavery, and that no man, white or black, who was friendly to the Union was safe in the South. There were reported 1,000 murders in the South, with few of the criminals brought to justice. And the country was convinced that the president had disrupted the Union Party and was conspiring with Democrats, North and South, to drive out the Republicans. In the election of 1866, there was on the side of Congress a Union Party with a center block of Republicans, a left wing of radical abolitionists, and a right wing of reactionary war Democrats. Andrew Johnson tried to unite the Western radicals and the war Democrats into a new third party, to be reinforced eventually by the return of the secessionists. But between extreme democracy and reaction, there was no common ground. He only succeeded in getting the support of a few of the war Democrats and the Copperheads, who were either Southerners living in the North or Northern men with Southern principles. State and national conventions met. Johnson and his friends started out on August 14th to form a Johnson Party. the National Union Convention met in Philadelphia, with states North and South represented. A special wingworm, 2 stories high, was erected on Girard Avenue, seating the 10,000 people. The interior was decorated with flags. Horace Greeley called it a bread and butter convention, composed of 99% of rebels and copperheads. Thomas Nast ridiculed the convention in his cartoons in Harper's Weekly. Their declarations of principles accepted unanimously declared the war had maintained the Constitution and the Union unaltered, and that neither Congress nor the general government had any authority to deny the constitutional right of the congressional representation to any state. They urged the election of congressmen who would admit all loyal representatives from the South. They affirmed the inability of a state either to succeed or exclude any other state from the Union, and the constitutional right of each state to decide for itself the qualifications for voting within its borders. They insisted that the Constitution could not be legally amended, except with all the states voting in Congress, and action by all the legislators. They denied any desire in the Southern states to restore slavery. They proclaimed the invalidity of rebel debts and the inviolability of federal debts, and the right of freedmen to the same protection of persons and property as afforded to whites. They urged government aid for federal soldiers and their families. Finally, they expressed wholeheartedly endorsement of Andrew Johnson. The weakness of this meeting was that, first, it contained, in fact, few Republicans, most of the delegates being well-known Democrats who had opposed Lincoln. It was dubbed the Conference of Copperheads, and among the delegates were Vallandigham and Fernando Wood. Secondly, the meeting was not followed up with careful organization. No sooner had this convention adjourned that Southern Loyalists met in Philadelphia on September 3rd to confer with Northern Republicans, including Horace Greeley, John Jacob Astor, Carl Schurz, Frederick Douglass, Brownlow, Thomas E. Benton, Morton, Cameron, and Gerry. This conference met in 2 parts, one Northern and one Southern. Frederick Douglass was elected delegate from Rochester to attend the convention. It was a great honor for a black man in a white city. On the train, he met Southern and Western delegates, including Governor Oliver P. Morton of Indiana. After consultation, a committee waited on him, and through a Louisiana spokesman, insisted on their high respect for him, but also on their fear that it was inexpedient for him to attend the convention, on the account of the cry of social and political equality, which would be raised against the Republican Party. Douglass replied, "Gentlemen, with all respect, you might as well ask me to put a loaded pistol to my head and blow my brains out, as to ask me to keep out of this convention, to which I have been duly elected." He pointed out the fact that his election was widely known and his failure to attend would be inexplicable. Later, he was warned against walking in the procession, and for a while, it looked as if he would have to walk alone, until Theodore Tilton of New York offered to walk with him. In that parade, he met a daughter of his former owner. During the convention, Speed, who had just resigned from the cabinet, called the president a tyrant, and the Southern Loyalists attacked Johnson, but split on Negro suffrage. A part of the convention finally adopted this declaration: "The government, by national and appropriate legislation enforced by national authority, shall confer on every citizen in the states we represent the American birthright of impartial suffrage and equality before the law. This is the one all-sufficient remedy. This is our great and pressing necessity." Governor Brownlow of Tennessee, in discussing Negro suffrage at this same convention on September 3rd, 1866, said, "Some gentlemen, from a mistaken view of my character, said they were afraid of Negro suffrage and wanted to dodge it. I have never dodged any subject, nor have I ever been found on both sides of any subject. While I am satisfied with everything done here, I would go further. I am an advocate of Negro suffrage and impartial suffrage. I would rather associate with loyal Negroes than with disloyal white men. I would rather be buried in a Negro graveyard than in a rebel graveyard. And after death, I would sooner go to a Negro heaven than a white rebel's heaven." There followed in September 2 military conventions, one in Cleveland, September 18th, by friends of Johnson, which did not mention Negro suffrage. It denounced the abolitionists and said that they were trying to force another war. It contained many Democrats and few conservative Republicans. Confederate officers at Memphis, including General Forrest of Fort Pillow fame, sent sympathy by telegram, which was unfortunate publicity. In answer to this, a national convention of citizens, soldiers, and sailors was held at Pittsburgh, September 25th and 26th. There were many volunteer officers of high rank, and Johnson was denounced, and the 14th Amendment advocated. This convention had great influence on public opinion and popularized the 14th Amendment. The issue in the election of the fall of 1866 turned on whether Congress should recognize Southern states as reconstructed by Johnson. It was not a presidential year, but congressmen and state legislators were to be elected. The real campaign began in August, with the 14th of August convention in Philadelphia. This convention greatly encouraged Johnson, and he wrote it, attacking Congress for preventing the restoration of peace and the Union, and denying that it was really a legal Congress. If I had wanted authority, or if I had wished to perpetuate my own power, how easily could I have held and wielded that which was placed in my hands by the measure called Freedmen's Bureau Bill. On July 4th, he had issued another proclamation of general amnesty, and on August 20th, he declared the Civil War at an end. Already in the spring, he promised to lay the cornerstone of a monument to Stephen A. Douglas in Chicago, and he left Washington, August 28th, on a great campaign tour, which was to sweep the country. He took General Grant with him and members of his cabinet, and Seward joined him in New York. Johnson stopped at Philadelphia, New York, Albany, and then went west by way of Cleveland, Chicago, and St. Louis. It was an extraordinary and increasingly painful effort, by which Johnson definitely defeated himself and his own political policies. He showed genius for saying the wrong thing. In New York, for instance, he asked, "Are we prepared for the cost of war, to continue to disrupt condition of the country? Why are we afraid of representatives of the South? Some have grown fat. Some have grown rich by the aggression and destruction of others." In Philadelphia, he declared that God was a tailor like himself. At Cleveland, his audience became a mob, while the president himself increased the hubbub. The city authorities had made preparations for a polite reception, but as he proceeded with this harangue, the mob took complete possession of the crowd. Someone cried, "Why not hang Thad Stevens and Wendell Phillips?" "Yes," yelled Johnson, "why not hang them?" Some towns hung out black flags and banners. No welcome to traitors. Bands played the death march. Johnson shouted in defiance. His egotism was ridiculed. He was charged with being drunk and traitor and a demigod. On he reeled. As Burgess said, the trip degraded the presidential office. The New York Tribune watched it with a feeling of national shame and called it the stumbling tour of an inebriated demagogue. The New York World excused him by asking who of all presidents had been lower than Lincoln in personal bearing. The Herald put the blame on Seward's shoulders, the Mephistopheles of the administration. Lowell called the journey an indecent orgy. Rhodes said he was intoxicated at Cleveland, while Schuler declares he was sober. The culmination came in St. Louis, where Johnson declared that the blood of the New Orleans riot was on Congress, and decried that the diabolical and nefarious policies of Stevens, Phillips, and Sumner. The most charitable thing that the defenders of Andrew Johnson can say of him is that occasionally he got drunk, for too much liquor alone would excuse such extraordinary conduct and performances as his vice presidential inauguration, his speech of February 22nd, 1866, his exhibition at Cleveland, and his St. Louis debauch. If he was not an occasional drunkard, he was God's own fool. He returned to Washington, as Schwartz says, an utterly confitted and disgraced man, having gone out to win popular support and having earned only public disgust. The role of Seward during this episode was pathetic. One of the wits of this time spoke of Seward's new office of bear leader. Unfortunately, he was very unsuccessful even in this task, for he could do little more than apologize for Johnson, and in a few commonplace sentences call upon the audience to support the president in opposition to Congress. At Niagara, he told the crowd that Lincoln had been traduced when alive, but after his assassination, all hearts inclined to the deepest sorrow, and it would be the same if Johnson should be taken off. To the citizens of Buffalo, he stated the issue as follows. The question is between the president and the Congress. Of all that has been done to bring us so near to consummation of Reconstruction, you see that nothing has been done. That was nothing done through the direction, agency, activity, perseverance, and patriotism of Johnson, President of the United States. Will you stand by Congress, or will you stand by the president? The Republicans took every advantage of the situation. They saw in Johnson the instinct of the poor white cropping out. He cannot shake off the boot-licking proclivity born and bred in him towards the aristocracy of the South. Miserable fool. Stephen made but one speech in the campaign of 1866. He said that he had been directed by his physician neither to think, speak, nor read until the next session of Congress, that he had followed the orders not to read almost literally. It is true. I have amused myself with a little light, frivolous reading. For instance, there was a serial account from day to day of a very remarkable circus that traveled through the country, from Washington to Chicago and St. Louis, and from Louisville back to Washington. I read that with some interest, expecting to see in it celebrated an establishment, one which from its heralding was to beat Dan Rice and all the old circuses that had went forth. I expected great wit, from which the celebrated character of its clowns. As the campaign of 1866 progressed, the agitation in favor of granting suffrage to the Negro as a necessary protection of his freedom became marked. First of all, industry and trade were convinced that they could not trust the white South. Therefore, the more extreme ideas which Stevens had advocated were allowed to be broadcast. Their logic was strong and their methods popular. People had faith in the laws and wanted some great enactment in keeping with the greatness of the war. It was a ripe time for amending the Constitution and inaugurating final reforms. These reforms might be in advance at a time, but they were worth trying, and there appeared to be no middle path. Thus, as the campaign went on, Negro suffrage occupied a more and more important position. Stevens and Wade, Sumner, Chase, Schultz, and Chandler were in favor of it. Too many Northerners, it had been at first unthinkable, but more and more had become convinced. The nation urged full Negro suffrage and Negro civil rights, but opposed the exclusion of white leaders from office. The doctrine that this is a white man's government and intended for white men only is, as Perry professed it, a monstrous and doctrine as ever was concocted. To allow the states to reorganize on this basis, the nation added, would make the very name of American democracy a hissing and byword among the nations of the earth. To have this theory of the nature of government boldly thrust in our faces now, after the events of the last 4 years, by men who have come red-handed from the battlefield, and those whose garments the blood of our brothers and sisters still cling, and to know that the president, who owes in part at least his ability to be president to the valor and blood of colored troops, concurs with them in this scandalous repudiation of democratic principles, are things which the country, we trust, will find it hard to bear. For a brief period, for the 7 mystic years that stretched between Johnson's swing round the circle to the panic of 1873, the majority of thinking Americans of the North believed in equal manhood of Negroes. They acted accordingly, with a thoroughness and clean-cut decision that no age which does not share the faith can in the slightest comprehend. They did not free draft animals, nor enfranchise guerrillas, nor welcome morons to Congress. They simply recognized black folk as men. The South was called for war, said James Russell Lowell, and he had given it to her. We will fix the terms of peace ourselves, and we will teach the South that Christ is disguised in a dusky race. Then came in 1873 through 76, sudden and complete disillusionment, not at Negroes, but at the world, at business, at work, at religion, at art. A bitter protest of Southern property reinforced Northern reaction. And while, after long years, the American world recovered in most matters, it has never yet quite understood why it could ever have thought that black men were altogether human. There were men in the South and former slave owners who knew the truth and spoke it. They knew that there could be no salvation for the South in time for eternity until the former slave went forth as a man. But the entrenched intolerance of the South, coupled with the awful grief at the death of the flower of Southern manhood, let such prophets speak but few words. They spoke here and there in nearly every Southern state, but they were soon threatened into silence, and there prevailed a bitter hatred and cry for vengeance from the people who could not brook defeat because they had been used to victory and had slave-born habits of arrogance. For their grief, none had greater sympathy than the bulk of their former slaves. They served and even succored their former masters. And yet upon these their fellows were eventually placed the whole wrath of the South, which it could not turn toward the North. And especially it fell upon the freedmen who felt their freedom, who were uplifted by new ambition, who showed the gathered resentment of 200 years of whipping, kicks, and cuffs. In fine, on them who had rolling in their ears God's great depesuit potence. He hath put down the mighty from their seats, and hath exalted them of low degree. After the final elections of 1866, the Republicans had 143 members in the House, and the Democrats 49. All states gave strong majorities to the Republican Party, except the border states of Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky. In the South, Democratic candidates were universally successful. Not counting the South, the Republicans in the Senate had a two-thirds majority and nearly a three-fourths majority in the House. Through the winter of 1866 through 1867, notwithstanding the results of the election of 1866, the South rejected the 14th Amendment. Virginia gave 1 vote in favor, North Carolina 11 out of 148, South Carolina 1 vote, Georgia 2 out of 169, Alabama 10 out of 106, Texas 5, and Arkansas 3. Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana were unanimously against it. Thus the South defied Congress and demanded that the disenfranchised Negro should be counted as basis of representation. The South was encouraged to this and stand by the president. The government of Alabama telegraphed him that the rejection of the 14th Amendment could be recognized by his state. But Johnson discouraged him. This increased the strength of the Republicans in the North. The president's message of December 4th, 1866, with all the earmarks of Seward, was calm and skillful. He said that the war was ended and that the nation should now proceed as a free, prosperous, and united nation. He had already informed Congress of his efforts for the gradual restoration of states. All that remained now was the admission to Congress of loyal senators and representatives. While Congress had been considering this, the president had appointed various public officials and the 13th Amendment had been passed. Yet Congress hesitated to admit the southern states to representation, and after 8 months, only Tennessee had been admitted. He wished to leave the whole matter of suffrage to the states, and he was significantly silent on the black codes. The second session of the 39th Congress began December 3rd. The Senate asked for a report on the condition of southern states, since the president had said practically nothing about it. The president replied December 19, 1866. As a result of the measures instituted by the executive, which the viewing of the inducing of a resumption of the functions of state comprehended in the inquiry of the Senate, the people of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee have reorganized their respective state governments and are yielding obedience to the laws and government of the United States with more willingness and greater promptitude than under the circumstances would reasonably have been anticipated. The proposed amendment to the Constitution, providing for the abolition of slavery forever within the limits of this country, has been ratified by each one of those states, with the exception of Mississippi, from which no official information has been received. And in nearly all of them, measures have been adopted or are now pending to confer upon freedmen rights and privileges which are essential to their comfort, protection, and security. In Florida and Texas, the people are making commendable progress in restoring their state governments, and no doubt it is entertained that they will. And at early period, any condition to resume all their practical relations to the federal government. It is true that in some of the states, the demoralizing effect of the war are to be seen in occasional disorders, but these are local in character, not frequent in occurrence, and are rapidly disappearing as the authority of civil law is extended and sustained. Perplexing questions were naturally to be expected from the great and sudden change in the relations between the two races, but systems are gradually developing themselves under which freedmen will receive the protection to which is justly entitled, and by means of this labor make himself a useful and independent member of the community in which he has his home. The transubstantiation of Andrew Johnson was complete. He had begun as champion of the poor laborer, demanding that the land monopoly of the Southern oligarchy be broken up, so as to give access to the soil, the South and West, to free labor. He had demanded the punishment of those Southerners who, by slavery and war, had made such an economic program impossible. Suddenly thrust into the presidency, he had retreated from this attitude. He had not only given up extravagant ideas of punishment, but he dropped his demand for dividing up plantations when he realized that Negroes would largely be beneficiaries. Because he had not conceived of Negroes as men, he refused to advocate universal democracy, of which in his young manhood he had been the fiercest advocate, and made strong alliances with those who would restore slavery under another name. This change did not come by deliberate thought or conscious desire to hurt. It was rather the tragedy of the American prejudice made flesh, so that the man born to narrow circumstances, a rebel against economic privilege, died with the conventional ambition of a poor white to be the associate and benefactor of a monopolist, planters, and slave drivers. In some respects, Andrew Johnson is the most pitiful figure of American history. A man who, despite great power and great ideas, became a puppet, played upon by the mighty fingers and selfish, subtle minds, groping, self-made, unlettered, and alone drunk, not so much with liquor as with the heady wine of sudden and accidental success. My wild soul waited on as falcons hover. I beat the reedy fins as I trampled past. I heard the mournful loon in the marsh beneath the moon. And then, with feathery thunder, the bird of my desire broke from the cover, flashing silver fire. High up among the stars, I saw his pinions spire. The pale clouds gazed aghast as my falcon dropped upon him and gripped him and held him fast. William Rose Benet.